Foreign Secretary, welcome to this meeting of the Committee on Arms Export Controls, and also thank you for bringing with you your officials, Mr. Richard Toufaret and Mr. James Paper. Foreign Secretary, I want to commence with what is undoubtedly the single most important policy issue which the committee has been addressing, as you well know. At the committee's oral evidence session with you on the 7th of February 2012, we asked you for a clear statement as to the government's policy on arms exports and internal repression. And you said that the policy was, and I quote, "We will not issue licenses where we judge there is a clear risk that the proposed export might provoke or prolong regional or internal conflicts, or which might be used to facilitate internal repression." Foreign Secretary, is that still the government's policy?
Yes, the clear risk applies to both parts of the sentence. Let's be absolutely clear.
Sorry, I didn't quite hear that.
Clear risk applies to both parts of the sentence, in line with our long-established policy. And the Business Secretary and I have written to the committee in the last couple of days following your session with him on the 18th of December to be absolutely clear about that. It's the long-standing policy to follow criterion 2 of the consolidated criteria. We won't grant a license if there is a clear risk that the items might be used for internal repression. So clear risk applies to the whole of the sentence of 2 years ago.
Well, Foreign Secretary, that is absolutely not a construction that anybody, I think, could reasonably have placed on your previous statement to the committee on the 7th of February 2012. It is also a construction that certainly cannot be placed on the policy that was set in October 2000 by the then government, which the present government is claiming it is adhering to. There are two separate tests. One is the clear risk test, which is set out in criteria 2, which we accept completely, and you will have seen on my letter to you of Monday that we repeated this a total of 26 times in our previous report. That is set out in criteria 2 as the first test. But it is a relatively limited test because you can always argue that there is a risk, but the risk isn't clear, and therefore the export license should be granted. Completely separate from criterion 2 is the policy paragraph in the original Peter Hague statement of October 2000. And that is the second crucial test. And it is absolutely clear that the wording there is not subject to clear risk. The wording reads, I quote, "An export license will not be issued if the arguments for doing so are outweighed by concern that the goods might be used for internal repression." That is a policy that has existed since the year 2000. That is the policy which you stated to the committees on the 7th of February 2012. So, Foreign Secretary, the only conclusion that we can make from the answer you gave to my first question is that you are now resting the government's policy solely on criteria 2, the clear risk test, and that, contrary to what you and your fellow ministers have been saying to us, that there has been no change in policy, that represents a fundamental change of policy from that previously enunciated by the previous government and by yourself on the 7th of February 2012.
No, Mr. Chairman, I don't agree with that at all. There hasn't been any change of policy under the last government or the current government. It was the statement of, you correctly read out the statement of Peter Hague and the Minister in the year 2000. But that, what he was giving then, as I understand it, was a summary of the detailed criteria. The last government pursued the policy of criteria 2, of clear risk as the test. And that is what we've carried on under the current government. So the policy that's always been applied, and officials can come in on this and correct, they will, officials go back further than the ministers, of course. The policy that's always been applied is the clear risk test, and the policy that's applied now is the clear risk test. There's a particular issue on the suspension of licenses to Egypt, as you know. But the clear risk test is the one that is always applied, and that is our policy. That's the policy Her Majesty's government pursues. And if we wanted to change it, we would, of course, consult with our partners in the EU, we would inform Parliament, we would inform our officials. That's what we wanted to do, but we haven't done any of those things because we haven't at any point changed the policy on this.
Well, Foreign Secretary, you say that. That is not a construction that can be put on your original statement to the committees on the 7th of February 2012. And as far as the previous government's policy is concerned, I can tell you that I have personally spoken informally to Peter Hague, who has told me that he deliberately inserted that policy paragraph into the written statement which was made in October 2000. And he has personally told me that he attached profound importance to that policy statement. Obviously, it will be for the committees as to whether they wish to try and seek further evidence from Mr. Peter Hague. But I have to make it very clear that your statement today is a fundamentally different statement of policy from the one which you put to the committees on the 7th of February 2012.
I don't agree with that at all, Mr. Chairman. The clear risk stated at the beginning of a sentence can apply to both parts of the sentence. I think that's really all we're arguing about here. And it absolutely did apply. Sometimes we use sentences in a brief form to try to assist, to try to get through the business of Parliament. So clear risk applies to both parts. It always has done, and I'm very interested in what you say about Peter Hague, and we'll be happy to hear more about that, but I'm confident in saying, I mustn't speak for the previous government, that the previous government applied the clear risk test just as we applied. I turn to the officials to confirm that point. So they are nodding in the affirmative for the record.
Sorry. It is for ministers to speak for the policy of the previous government.
I wish it was.
Yes, it is for
those ministers, the previous ministers.
It is for those ministers to speak for the policy of the previous government. But on your...
But be in no doubt, Mr. Chairman, sorry to interrupt there, the policy implemented, the policy actually being pursued by the previous government was the same one as the policy of the current government.
So you state, Foreign Secretary, and that remains to be tested. But I go back to the wording of your statement to the committees. And I don't think any reasonable construction is other than the one which I put to you. You said the clear risk applies to both parts. I suggest it doesn't. It says, we will not issue licenses where we judge there is a clear risk that the proposed export might provoke or prolong regional or internal conflicts. It doesn't then say, or that. And if it was all that, the clear risk would apply to both. Quite differently, it says, after the comma, or which might be used to facilitate internal repression. This is not semantics. This is absolutely a fundamental point of policy. And it will be for the committee to take a view as to how you have responded to my question. But on any reasonable construction of the wording, the fact that after the comma it says, or which might be used to facilitate internal repression, to me is absolutely clear that the so-called clear risk test does not apply to the second half of the sentence.
I don't agree with that either. I can see how it's possible to read it a different way, but since we've always been absolutely clear that it should be read in the way that I've described, I might be best placed as the author of the sentence to be able to say what it's always meant.
Sorry. Forgive me. And I go back to what I said to you earlier, which is that the separation of the clear risk test from the other, which might be used to facilitate internal repression, is made even more clear by the fact that the wording of which might be used for internal repression is entirely separate and in a separate paragraph in the original Peter Hague statement.
Well, as I say, on the previous government, we'd all be interested to know what Peter Hague says about that, but the policy implemented by the previous government and the policy implemented by the current government throughout is to apply the clear risk test to items that could be used for internal repression. So whatever our arguments about the words, that is the policy that for the last 13 years has been pursued in practice. That is how officials and ministers, when applying these tests to licenses, that's the test we're using in practice on a day-to-day basis. And I can assure you there's been no change in that. It's possible to make a case for a change in that, but there hasn't been a change. And if there were to be a change, we would certainly inform Parliament, and we would want to coordinate it in any case with our partners across the European Union.
Foreign Secretary, the committees will reflect further on this exchange that's taken place. We're now going to move to the very important issue of the government's policy on export licences for chemicals to Syria, and Fabian Hamilton.
Thank you, Chairman. Foreign Secretary, can I move on to this issue of chemical exports to Syria, which I understand were made as late as the middle of 2012, before they were actually revoked in September 2012. And I believe that the two extant licences were for sodium fluoride and potassium fluoride, which are dual-use chemicals, and it was suggested that they were going to be used for industrial processes, including the manufacture of toothpaste and the fluoridation of water. I understand that they were revoked, as I say, in September. The company buying those chemicals were Awad Amora and Co., company and partners of Damascus in Syria. And I just wondered whether the facts that Syria was known to be a major holder of chemical weapons, that the chemicals being exported were both precursors for the production of sarin gas, and that the recipient company had been identified previously to be a front company for the Assad regime, and of course the fact that there was a civil war in progress in Syria didn't raise any concerns when the licence applications were considered. I just wonder whether you can comment on that. It seems strange that in spite of the fact these are dual-use chemicals, that no question marks were raised. I wondered whether you'd had an input.
Well, these were considered, but I think considered correctly by officials at the time, because they weren't covered by the sanctions at the time. On the company, Awad Al-Mora, the information about that was checked across the government, and there was no information to corroborate the reports. I think Vince Cable also commented on this when you asked him the other day. There was no information to corroborate the 2004 media reports linking the company to the Saddam Hussein regime, nor was there any evidence linking the company to any chemical weapons program, nor have we seen any subsequently. So whatever media reports there have been, the government hasn't been able to establish any such evidence, if that is of any reassurance on that.
May I interrupt you, just ask whether it was confirmed to you that these were precursor chemicals for the manufacture of sarin gas? I'm not a chemist, so I don't know, but presumably you had some expert advice on this.
Well, no, these would not be considered by ministers at the time. As you know, we've really increased the number of licenses that are considered by ministers now. 300 a year is the latest figure, which is nearly a tenfold increase compared to 2010, and there's a huge increase in ministerial scrutiny. But that only happens where there are legal grounds to refuse a license, so that ministers really have something to consider.
Forgive me, Foreign Secretary, this was 2012. Yes. The civil war was raging. Things were looking pretty grim. We know that the Syrian government had chemical weapons, access to chemical weapons. I just wondered why any export licences at that time were not given to ministers for approval. For any
well, two things to say about that. I think, first of all, if such a situation arose again, as we've already seen in the Egypt crisis, I think we would rapidly apply a suspension of all licenses in a new Syria crisis, unless all the facts were available very quickly. So using the new mechanism, we're always improving the system, and we're often using the advice of these committees to improve the system. We would apply a rapid suspension of all licenses. And the speed with which licenses are and can be reviewed has been greatly improved also since that time. Again, as we saw in August last year in the case of Egypt, within 7 days of the agreement across all EU member states to suspend licenses to Egypt, every license had been dealt with. So I think quite a lot would have changed since this episode. I don't want to say that everything would now happen exactly as it did then. Procedures have improved. What we can do rapidly to suspend licenses has moved on tremendously, even since 2012. But if you look back at, was it correctly handled at the time? Well, yes, it was right that it would have official consideration because these chemicals have legitimate commercial uses for making toothpaste and window and shower frames. Each license was assessed against the criteria. There was no embargo on these chemicals at the time. The stated end use was credible. There was no evidence of any link to a chemical weapons program. And when we agreed new sanctions on Syria in June 2012, these licenses were revoked and no chemicals were exported under these licenses, which is, I think, of additional reassurance to people. So those things were all done and they were done correctly. But would it all happen much faster under today's procedures? Yes, it would.
Thank you.
Foreign Secretary, before we leave dual-use chemicals, one of the questions which I put to the Business Secretary back in October to see whether we were learning any lessons from what has happened in relation to Syria, I asked him to set out the dual-use chemicals which have been approved by the British government since 2003 to both known holders of chemical weapons and to known non-signatories and ratifiers of the Chemical Weapons Convention. And the Business Secretary, in his Annex 2 of his reply of the 11th of October, gave a detailed list of those export license approvals to countries other than Syria. They included Burma, North Korea, Egypt, Iraq, Israel, Libya, Russia, and the USA. Have you and the Business Secretary combed through this list and other applications to such countries that are in front of you? And are you making any changes of policy in the light of those revelations, which many of us will find very disturbing?
Well, I'll turn to the officials to add to my reply on this. In some of those countries, of course, the policy will have changed in any case since 2003. So clearly there could be licenses issued before such a policy change. In other cases, it's possible such licenses are for the sorts of things we've just been talking about on Syria. While they may be dual use, they may credibly be for the manufacture of toothpaste. And so it's very important to bear those things in mind. They will all have been tested against the consolidated criteria, and we'd be very concerned to hear if any of them hadn't been, of course. But perhaps the officials would like to add to those points.
Yes, by all means, indeed they were. Anything that is controlled is checked against the consolidated criteria, and if it is not in breach or in crossing the threshold of any of the criteria, then we'll have to consider whether, for example, it is covered by an embargo. But if not, then there is no reason to refuse a license. Admit that some of those countries are non-members or non-signatories to the Chemical Weapons Convention, as indeed was the case with Syria, but that in itself is not sufficient reason to refuse a license.
Why should we be exporting sodium sulfide, which is a dual-use chemical, to a country like North Korea?
These things have legitimate commercial uses. They are dual-use chemicals, and I don't know the specific example, but I have to assume that it was a case that there was a legitimate and credible commercial end use. It was checked against the risks of diversion to a chemical weapons program and considered in that case that there was not sufficient grounds to refuse it.
Don't ministers take into account whether a particular country might be a holder of chemical weapons?
Well, we apply the consolidated criteria and we apply any sanctions regime that is in force. So, and the sanctions cover a wide range of goods, usually for any country with chemical weapons. So if any license that has been approved clearly did not fall within those sanctions.
Now I'm going to turn to the government's policy on the export of arms or not to the Syrian opposition. Mike Gapes.
Secretary, when the government vetoed with France the continuation of the European Union's arms embargo on Syria in April last year, the reason given, and you repeated it in the letter that you've sent to us, was to send a powerful political signal to the Assad regime. Given that the Assad regime continues to murder tens of thousands of people, there are 120,000 dead, Aleppo is being bombed, and there is no sign that the Assad regime has in any way moderated its behaviour, how effective do you think that political signal has been?
Well, so far none of the political signals from the rest of the world to the Assad regime have been successful in bringing an end to this horror. That doesn't mean that it's wrong to try them. We have passed presidential statements at the UN Security Council. Of course, we've not been able to pass resolutions there. Many countries in the world have said many things about the Assad regime and its loss of legitimacy. We also took this action on the EU arms embargo. None of those things have succeeded yet in changing the behaviour of the Assad regime, but it doesn't mean that it's wrong to try them. And as we come towards the Geneva peace talks in 2 weeks' time, which I will attend for this country, all the pressure that can be mustered on the Assad regime is necessary.
The decision was taken to lift the embargo to allow potentially the supply of lethal and non-lethal equipment to the Syrian opposition. What's the current position with regard to the supply of lethal and non-lethal equipment? And as I understand it, because the Free Syrian Army's headquarters or bases were overrun, the supply was suspended before Christmas. Can you clarify where we are on that? What kind of equipment is now in the hands of people that we don't wish to hold that equipment? And what guarantee have we got that if there was a resumption of the supply, the same thing won't happen and we might end up arming or supplying sophisticated equipment to Al-Qaeda-linked groups?
Well, there's no question in our current policy of arming, is the first point. And part of your question was about what is the lethal support that we give, and the answer to that is we don't give any.
We don't, but other countries do.
Well, I can only answer here for
within the EU,
Her Majesty's government.
Are there any other EU countries that are?
I'm not aware of other countries in the EU doing so. And certainly we don't, the United Kingdom doesn't. In fact, it's not been our approach in any of the conflicts in the Middle East since the so-called Arab Spring began in 2011. It's not been our approach to send arms to any of the protagonists. Even in Libya, where our own armed forces were engaged, we didn't do that. And we haven't done that in Syria.
So you're telling me that no lethal equipment of any kind has been supplied to any faction in the Syrian opposition?
By the United Kingdom, yes, that's right. And that remains the policy. On the you quite rightly asked about the non-lethal equipment and the position since what happened with the seizure of the Supreme Military Council stores in early December. With them, we have given some non-lethal equipment. This includes, for instance, in August last year, we gave them escape hoods in order to escape chemical attack, detector paper for chemical attack, nerve agent pre-treatment tablets. Typically, we have given them equipment that might save lives. that they could use to save lives, but that is not lethal to anybody else. Now, even that sort of equipment, and the latest equipment we were proposing to send to them included commercially available medical and communications equipment. That we have put on hold, given what happened at their stores and headquarters in December, and we're keeping that situation under very close review to see when we can, and if we can, resume such supplies.
If you were to resume, what certainty is there that it won't again fall into the hands of the bad people?
Well, first of all, I should have said in answer to the last question, we're not aware of any UK-supplied equipment having been seized by anybody else. The great majority of these stores are intact. A great majority of them have also been checked. There is no report of any loss of any UK-supplied equipment. So I think that should be of some reassurance. And clearly we would want to know how they were going to work together, how secure areas are. An additional assurance in this comes, of course, from the fact we're not supplying any lethal equipment to them, so that even if it did fall into the wrong hands, it would not be something that could be used against other people.
Does that include vehicles?
We have supplied a small number of vehicles, of four-wheel drive vehicles again, but they are not affected by the recent incident.
But vehicles could potentially be used to assist people moving around who had got weapons from elsewhere, and therefore would be a force multiplier for them in the conflict.
There's no evidence that the vehicles we've supplied have fallen into anybody's hands other than the people we've supplied them to, and we're not at the moment supplying more vehicles.
Final question. Your statement to us in February 2012, saying that you would not export where it might provoke or prolong regional or internal conflicts. Isn't the case that if we are supplying even non-lethal equipment into a military conflict to assist one side in that conflict amongst the many sides in the Syrian conflict, that we are actually going to help to prolong that conflict? Is there not some inconsistency between the stated position of the government from 2012 and this decision with regard to arming elements within the Syrian opposition?
No, for several reasons. First of all, I think that unless there is a moderate opposition able to function in Syria, one that is committed to a democratic, non-sectarian future for Syria, the conflict there will be longer even than it might otherwise be. The chances of a political solution there will become even harder to bring about a political solution. If Syria faces a choice between only Assad and extremists, there won't be a political solution. By helping a moderate opposition, we're trying to keep alive the possibility of a political solution. And we're also only sending equipment that helps to save lives. And so we're not sending equipment that is being used to prolong a conflict. We're sending equipment that is being used, hopefully, to try to create the circumstances in which conflict can be brought to an end.
Well, Geneva, though, the Americans are reported... Yes, it will be. The Americans are reported to be rethinking their position and saying that their original position that we supported, that Assad must go, has become impossible, and that therefore they are rethinking with regard to the possibility of some deal at Geneva only being possible if the regime in some part remains. What's our position on that?
Well, there are several points in your question there. We've all been clear that some part of the regime plays a part in a political solution in Syria. The Geneva communique of June 30th, 2012, which we in the United States, Russia and others supported, speaks of forming a transitional government in Syria drawn from regime and opposition. That's a different matter from Assad having a role in the future. Syria, because that sentence goes on to say a transitional government formed by mutual consent. And it's impossible to imagine President Assad presiding over the future of Syria by the consent of a wide range of parties, including the opposition. So that's been our position. It is the position of the United States. In the London 11 communique in October, Secretary Kerry and I put our names to the same communique on Syria not having a future with Assad there. We'll be meeting again this weekend. We will adopt a new communique, but it will be fully consistent with the communique of October.
Foreign Secretary Derek Twigg, just one question, Derek, on this same subject.
Yeah, I do know with interest that when you spoke in the House about this, and also in your letter you talk about non-lethal weapons, not equipment, but we've just been talking about equipment. So to carry on with what Mr. Gates has been asking, could we just be clear on two things? In terms of the equipment that has been supplied, you've mentioned vehicles and communications equipment. Could you just give us an idea exactly what those communication equipment is and what the vehicles are, and are they capable of mounting weapons? And the final point is, at what point do you think, or what would be the key indicator that weapons would not fall into the hands of the extremists at some future point?
Well, we're not planning to supply lethal equipment, so on the weapons
I'm putting back to what your answer was to Mr. Gates.
But on the other...
there was two very things, vehicles and communications equipment. You were
yes,
very clear on that.
On those, the details that we can give about those are set out in the minutes that we send to parliamentary committees. I know you've asked about this
today,
in the House. Yes, but that is the information that we're able to supply, which isn't... We can't go into the... For obvious reasons, we can't go into the detail of communications equipment because that would help the Assad regime to frustrate, intercept, or otherwise deal with that communications equipment. But it is for the opposition, and it includes commercially available communications equipment, medical equipment. What we sent to them in the last consignment, set out to Mr. Gabe, escape hoods, detector paper, nerve agent pre-treatment tablets. On other occasions in the past, we've sent water purification kits, other commercial communications equipment.
We come back to vehicles now because you don't want to answer the issue.
No, I'm very happy to answer the issue. The vehicles, again, have been set out in a minute to Parliament. Bulletproof 4x4 vehicles. Small number of those, I think there were 5 of those involved. So that is what we have sent them. It is all non-lethal, and we've no evidence it's been used for any other purpose than what it was given for.
And the final point I asked you was, you say you stopped providing equipment because you're unsure it will fall into the hands of the Islamist extremists. At what point would you be... What key evidence would need to be provided to you to restart the supply of this non-lethal equipment?
Well, just to be clear, I wasn't saying we were unsure about it. Because the stores at Bab al-Hawa of the Supreme Military Council were seized by other groups, we put it on hold. We're not aware, including following checks on that equipment, of any UK-supplied equipment having been seized by any other group. What are the sort of things we want to know in order to be able to resume supplies? Well, obviously we and other countries who do this would have to have a high degree of confidence about such incidents being reduced in probability, about the stores being as secure as they possibly could be, and continued assurances about the use of such equipment.
We don't have that yet.
Well, I think given what happened in December, we need to take some time to take stock and have the necessary confidence. So we haven't taken any decision yet, nor is any decision imminent about resuming such supplies.
We're now going to turn to the issue of the extraordinary volume of automatic weapons, assault rifles, etc., which the government has approved for export, ostensibly for anti-piracy purposes. Anne McKetchin.
In the 15 months up to June of 2013, licences were given for over 30,000 assault rifles, 4,200 combat shotguns, over 11,000 rifles, 1,200 sniper rifles, and over 5,000 guns which are classified as sporting guns. When we raised this issue with the Secretary of State for BIS and his officials in December, it appeared to be that there was not one part of the process in which you examine licences where you actually look at the cumulative impact of the number of licences which you are granting. Would that be correct?
Well, I think he undertook, when you were asking about this, to look into this, which I think is entirely reasonable. I think that is what we should do. The committee raises a good point about this. However, we do have to bear certain things in mind here. One is that the vast majority of the private maritime security companies operating in the Indian Ocean are British. So probably a large proportion of the volume of such weapons are coming through our licensing system rather than that of another country. Second, a proportion of the weapons are in maintenance at any one time. Thirdly, the companies need a degree of operational flexibility. They're always going to have more such weapons than they are actually deploying. And furthermore, approximately 4,500 ships transit the high-risk area every month. And so once you think about that figure, 4,500 ships every month, that puts these figures into something of the right perspective. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't have a look at this and satisfy ourselves and the committee on the point that you were raising about the overall quantity.
I take it there's roughly an average number of weapons per vessel, and some will be in standby and some, as you say, will be in operation. But it does seem astonishing if I take, for the example of Mauritius, which we've exported in 15 months, and in just a period of 15 months, over 5,000 assault rifles and 3,200 rifles. And it does beg the question, how many vessels have been passing by Mauritius in that 15-month period to justify that level of export? Are you satisfied, Secretary of State, that all the weapons that are being used for their stated purpose are for anti-piracy and not being diverted? Have you made any study about the problem of diversion, which clearly is present in that region? And what controls exist for monitoring the weapons once they have been shipped across?
Well, there are a lot of controls. These companies have to meet strict conditions. They've got to keep detailed records. They've got to provide training for staff. They've got to have clear lines of accountability. Their UK offices are subject to regular inspection. Those visits are by BIS. They must sign up to the International Code of Conduct for private security service providers. I think you ask about Mauritius and the thousands of items involved. The 4,500 ships per month are transiting through that area, an area that is close by Mauritius. We don't have any evidence of the diversion of any of these weapons. If we did, we would take it extremely seriously, of course. And I think it's important to point out that so far this policy has been a contributing factor to the huge reduction in pirate attacks in recent times. It's one of the factors. But not a single merchant ship carrying private armed security guards has been hijacked. And so this is part of a successful policy overall. We have to be very vigilant about it, and you're quite right to ask these questions. But we are vigilant about it. It is a successful policy so far, and we haven't seen any evidence of any diversion. I don't know if it's an important issue. Do the officials want to add anything to what have I missed out anything?
No.
Good.
It would seem extraordinary, Foreign Secretary, that given the sheer volume of guns, that there has been not one case or suspicion of diversion over that period of time. I certainly accept, I'm sure the committee accepts, of the need for this type of equipment and of the particular dangers in the region, and you're right to comment on the success. But I think still the committee is concerned that given the sheer volume of weapons over a relatively short period of time, and the fact that weapons can of course last, their age in terms of how long they can be used for and utilised is quite substantial, why we have not perhaps made some more spot check investigations to ensure that we have this most rigorous as possible type of criteria to prevent diversion.
Well, those checks that I mentioned do take place regularly. They're taking place all the time. And these questions are absolutely understandable, and there are questions from NGOs about it who might be concerned, but I noticed that Amnesty International in their evidence to you said they've no specific evidence of large-scale diversions taking place or weapons being secured in unsafe facilities. And we don't have any evidence of any diversions taking place. We expect these companies to uphold very high standards. We will continue the inspections I've spoken of and the regular checks that I've spoken of. And the consequences for any company that didn't do so would be very serious, of course. They certainly wouldn't be getting any more licenses if they didn't observe the necessary standards.
Thank you.
Just one more question on this, James Gray.
Small question, and a detail which may be Biz rather than yourselves. What are 5,196 sporting guns used for?
That definitely is one to turn to the officials to answer.
I think we'd have to check that. I think this is probably one of the peculiarities, if you like, of the rating system for export licences, that certain bits of equipment come under certain headings. But I dare say that in these particular cases, although they may come under that heading, they are in fact useful for anti-piracy operations.
It does seem an enormous number. Combat shotguns are 4,200. These are different to combat shotguns. These are something other than combat shotguns. And one of the things that actually, oughtn't you really to know what they are or what they're for? They must have a purpose. Can't be for shooting a snipe.
Well, I think between the FCO and Biz, we will write you with further details on this point, so far as we can.
Good question. Another very important area, which is the government's policy on the export of surveillance equipment with the human rights implications of that. Bob Stewart.
Thank you, Chairman. There has been some concern raised about countries with bad human rights records, getting more surveillance equipment, because of course surveillance equipment can be used to intercept emails and the rest of it. Do you share these concerns that some people are raising, mainly NGOs of course?
Yes, we do need to we do agree that action is necessary to strengthen export controls in this area over certain cybersecurity related equipment and software. These products have legitimate uses in defending networks, tracking and disrupting criminals. Many of the exports that are listed under cryptographic headings are also, for instance, equipment for mobile telephone networks that then have a cryptographic aspect to them. So sometimes when you see, that there are several billion pounds of cryptographic material exported, it is an item of that kind. But we've got to recognise such equipment can also be used to conduct espionage, to track and disrupt political opponents. It could be used to restrict freedom of expression. So we do need to move the policy on this subject, and that's why we, the UK, have been leading work in the Wassenaar arrangement, which resulted in agreement last month to adopt new controls on specific technologies of concern. These are going to be implemented through the EU's controls on dual-use items. We'll submit further proposals to the relevant countries as necessary. We're also helping industry produce guidance on the potential risks posed by cybersecurity exports. Policy is moving forward on this as technology is changing, and we are also open to further suggestions and ideas about what we should do.
Thank you, Forrest. I think you actually kind of answered my second question, which was fundamentally in 2012, when the government addressing this committee, it suggested that international action was required on surveillance equipment, and you just suggested the international action is impending or has taken place. Have you got any other comment apart from that?
Well, it is underway, and we are at the forefront of it. We are leading it. We are putting forward the proposals. The officials in FCO and BIS are doing a very good job on this. We're working with other member states, with the European Commission, with the European Parliament, to implement these changes, I hope before the European Parliament elections in May. And if that doesn't prove possible, well then we certainly want them adopted later this year. So yes, we are pushing for changes in this area, and successfully so.
Thank you. Just following your answer you've just given to Bob Stewart's last question, as you'll be well aware, it was reported yesterday that the OECD has just launched a major investigation into exports from, I assume, the UK by G4S of surveillance equipment to the Israeli security authorities for use in the Palestinian-occupied territories. Can we be assured that the British government will be cooperating fully in the OECD's investigation?
We work closely with the OECD on all issues. So whatever the OECD want to ask about, we will, of course, assist them with. I don't think there will be any problem in doing that. Again, it's important to bear in mind, just again, as a general comment on this, if I can find the relevant information. This may not be the point the OECD are looking into, I don't know, but there is a license for cryptographic equipment to Israel, which involves software for building public mobile phone networks in residential areas and for small businesses. So sometimes what is listed as cryptographic material is something of that nature.
I'll just make the point that the reports yesterday were very explicit. These were surveillance equipment being supplied to the Israeli security forces.
Well, we will have a look at that, and of course we will always work with the OECD on any issue.
We're now going to turn to the government's new procedure for the suspension of export licences. Sir Malcolm Bruce.
Thank you, Chair. I think it was generally welcomed that in the light of the Arab Spring, the government reviewed the policy and said that they would allow for the immediate suspension of licences where there was a sharp deterioration in security or stability. But it's since emerged that, first of all, that policy only applied to new licences rather than to extant licences. So the first question is, can you say whether or not that's been extended? We had a discussion with the Secretary of State for BIS, and I got the impression from what he said, I think indeed he did say, I think that they recognised that you had licences which were unexpired. There wasn't much point in letting them complete that if you were not issuing new licences. What you had to do was stop the flow of equipment because of the deteriorating situation. So could you just tell us exactly what the situation is?
Well, the policy that he announced in February 2012 was to allow the government to quickly to suspend the processing of pending licence applications. However, that doesn't mean that we can't change that policy if necessary, if the circumstances require it. And in the case of Egypt, which is the one, which is the suspension that at the time we've actually used a suspension, the 21st of August last year, we agreed among EU foreign ministers that all of us, that all member states of the EU, would suspend export licences to Egypt. And so we did that including the extant licences. That involved, I think from memory, 47 licences. We suspended them all while the situation became clearer. As the situation became clearer, we have subsequently revoked some licences and confirmed others. Some remain suspended. So in that case, we applied it to extant licences as well. We have the flexibility to do so, and I think we'll learn from experience as we go along.
So you could basically say that in future, licence suspension will review all licences, including the extant ones. I mean, because it's nonsense to suspend new licences if there's more equipment from previous licences still going into the.
Well, I think it will depend on it would depend on the situation. But we did, in that case, suspend all the extant ones. We were able to do so, as I was mentioning earlier in another context, within a week. The officials were able to go through all the licenses within a week, much faster than the incidences we were talking about on Syria a couple of years ago. The systems now are in existence to do that. So we will have to judge each case as it comes along. We've considered using suspension on several other occasions in response to changes in circumstances in the last year, but in most of those cases, enough information has been available quickly enough for us just to be able to determine whether licenses needed revoking or to be able to continue with them, so we haven't needed to use the suspension mechanism in other cases.
Well, that partly answers my second and final question. The NGOs had said that they were concerned that you'd set the bar too high. I mean, what you've said is that you will review the licensing situation when you see a crisis developing. But their concern was that, for example, in Mali, it didn't seem to be applied at all. And I appreciate that Mali wasn't the top of our area of interest, or not, that it's much more a sphere for the French. But nevertheless, are you satisfied? What you've just said is that you have considered them, but are you satisfied that you are quick enough to respond? I mean, the world is changing very fast and becoming very unpredictable. And I think you will accept that the public, the media, will inevitably come to your door if they feel in a changing situation you haven't acted quickly enough or comprehensively enough to prevent weapons or other unsuitable equipment moving into a crisis situation. So
yes.
Do you accept the NGO's concerns, or do you feel you can meet?
Well, they're entirely understandable questions, and I'm very conscious of the responsibility that we have, which you point out. But to take Mali, since you raised Mali, just to use that as an example of why we didn't use the suspension mechanism in that particular case. We considered using that in January last year, but it wasn't necessary because within a short time of the crisis beginning, we had enough information to make valid risk assessments against the consolidated criteria. And in any case, in the case of Mali, the only military list equipment licensed for export since January has been protective equipment and communications equipment for use by UN personnel. So that's the. I don't think people would want us not to be able to supply such things to the UN.
I'm sorry, Chairman, I was going to say that was the last question, but you just the point was that the net effect of the Mali conflict was it displaced people with weapons into neighbouring states. So do you kind of keep the situation under review and say we may have closed that avenue, but we may possibly have opened up another problem area?
Well, yeah, that is that's really a wider policy issue of what happens in the whole of the Sahel region, and we are advocating and pursuing with France and other EU member states a comprehensive political and development approach to try to stop the problems of the Sahel spreading. So that demands a broader policy response that goes far beyond export controls. But yes, we're very alert for emerging problems. We won't hesitate to use the suspension mechanism. It clearly, when it is necessary and when it is used, it does give us the time then to check the facts. And so I think it's an important policy innovation that the Business Secretary announced in 2012, and I've no doubt, sadly, that it will be necessary to use it again.
Thank you. Foreign Secretary, we're now going to come to the government's export policy of arms towards two authoritarian regimes on which the committees have taken a somewhat different position from the government, but on which we thought we got an encouraging response from the Business Secretary. Anne Clwyd.
Foreign Secretary, can you confirm that the FCO, along with BIS, have accepted the committee's recommendation, now made twice, that the government should adopt a more cautious approach to regimes with authoritarian records before you issue a licence?
Well, we will apply the consolidated criteria, of course. But we always do so with the benefit of experience all the time. And there's been quite a lot of experience in this subject over the last couple of years, given the number of suspensions and revocations that we've had to make. So We apply these things with this in mind, and we're very conscious of what the committee has said about this. So we're always cautious on this subject.
Can you explain how this greater caution is manifested in your approach to licensing?
Well, we are, I think, as the committee knows, we're very careful about all the licenses. It's a rigorous process, a process that has been improved over recent years. It is informed by all FCO information, all our understanding of the world, of what may happen in a country, the risk of internal repression, the risk of regional or internal conflict. We're able to weigh all of those things heavily. So we use all the information available to us.
Well, in a country, for example, like the Maldives, where the political situation is very unsettled, what would your approach be to licensing towards that country?
Well, in the case of the Maldives, I think the only licenses that I can see listed are for use by private security companies in anti-piracy operations. So it overlaps with our earlier discussion, and the Maldives is part of that area. Our assessment is that weapons are held in secure storage while in the Maldives, that the companies concerned are signed up to the International Code of Conduct for private security service providers. So, although Maldives is listed as the country on the license, these are for those private security companies for anti-piracy work. They're not for the government of the Maldives to use.
Into the hands of the government of the Maldives?
Well, that is back to our earlier discussion. First of all, many of these things will be held offshore. But secondly, if any of those companies do allow weapons to fall into hands different from those that they're licensed for, well, then those companies aren't getting any more licenses.
Foreign Secretary, I want to turn now to the key policy area also of the government's policy of arms exports to countries of human rights concern. Adrian Bailey.
Thanks very much. Minister, I mean, you'll be aware that a previous committee report raised this issue. There are indeed 27 countries of human rights concern, plus a further 5 which are countries listed as causing concern. In your reply to the previous committee report, the government did give reassurance that, in effect, all these licensors were compliant. Having looked at examples of some of them, such as Iran, cryptographic equipment, components for military electronic equipment, Israel, components for electronic warfare equipment, service-to-air, service-to-surface missiles, etc. That does seem slightly, breathtaking. Can you really say that the 3,461 extant licenses as of May 2013 are compliant and comply with the government's policy not to issue licenses where they judge there is a clear risk that the proposed export might provoke or prolong regional or internal conflicts, or which may be used to facilitate internal repression?
Well, all licenses will have been assessed against those criteria. Yes, absolutely. And as you know, we have the power to revoke licenses if we think that those criteria are no longer met, and we do sometimes revoke licenses. Wherever there is any such evidence. In the case of Iran in 2012, the UK doesn't offer trade support for Iran, although we don't have a ban on trade with Iran, as the committees know. But the types of things that received licenses were civil aviation, machine tools, lubricants. There is cryptographic equipment there as well. It's those sorts of things. And those are not covered by, they would be items that are not covered by sanctions and that meet the consolidated criteria.
But Given the number of countries and the scale of and the potential use of something, do you not think that perhaps it's an area that needs to be re-examined? With respect, Minister, your reply does seem rather complacent.
Well, don't take it as being complacent. We're never complacent about these things, because I've seen over the last few years how rapidly issues can arise on export licenses. That's why we've introduced the suspension mechanism. That's why, as I say, we do revoke licenses. There's absolutely nothing complacent about it, and a huge amount of work goes on in testing licenses against the consolidated criteria, with, as I say, a tenfold increase in the last 3 years in the number of licenses that are referred to ministers for decision. 300 a year is just about one a day now that ministers consider ourselves, compared to 39 a year in 2010. That's no criticism. I'm not criticising my predecessors. The world has changed since then, and particularly with events in the Middle East. So there is no complacency about it. We're very rigorous about it. We don't hesitate to turn licenses down, but we do so in a way that is consistent, that is justified under the law and under the criteria, and that can be defended, and that is not obstructing normal trade, which these licensing systems are not intended to do.
In response to the committee previous report, you did say you had basically daily monitoring, or facilities for daily monitoring. Do you actually carry that out on these countries, on the extant contracts that there are now?
Well, I think the officials can probably best describe the processes that are involved. Certainly with every license, we ask the relevant questions. Ministers are frequently asking questions about many of the countries concerned. Do you want, Richard or James, do you want to add to this?
I don't have a great deal to add, Foreign Secretary. It's, as you say, when we are considering the risks against the criteria, we go into a great deal of detail, particularly for those countries which are of human rights concern, not only those on the FCO's list, but any country that we know there are human rights concern. We do go into a lot of detail. We ask the Post. We look at NGO evidence as well. We routinely monitor what Amnesty, Human Rights Watch and others are saying, and we take that all into account in the advice that we give to ministers. And after the event, well, of course, the Post have a standing requirement to keep an eye on developments in human rights in their countries, and to report back to us if there are any developments that might affect our licensing.
Foreign Secretary, you'll be aware that the committees, for the very first time in our last report, brought together the Foreign Office's designated 27 countries of top human rights concern worldwide, and we asked you to list all the extant arms export licenses to those 27 countries. Did it come as any surprise to you that there were over 3,000 such licenses, and that their total value was over £12 billion?
Not really, Mr. Chairman. No, this is a large industry for this country. It is a legitimate trade. We don't have a trade ban with those countries of concern. And so, of course, trade takes place between the UK and those countries. They involve some of the biggest economies in the world. As you know from the list of 27, they include the second biggest economy in the world, China.
But of top human rights concern to the British government?
All of these countries are countries of concern. We have a no-holds-barred report on human rights. We publish that every year. We're working on this year's report. We now do quarterly updates. Whatever the state of our relations with these countries, we don't hold back from speaking about our human rights concerns. But it hasn't been the policy, it's not the policy of this government or of previous British governments to prevent trade with countries that are of human rights concern. There may be specific sanctions that apply to some of them. Then we implement those sanctions. But that's different from obstructing all trade with them.
Can we now turn to another key area, which is the export of cryptographic equipment and fluid?
Foreign Secretary, doesn't it seem extraordinary that we're selling cryptographic equipment to countries such as Iran, Libya, Russia, Zimbabwe?
It's I've made a couple of references to this in answer to earlier, because it relates to other subjects we've discussed. The majority of such licenses are for commercial equipment for commercial end use, building public mobile phone networks, internet infrastructure, or building virtual private networks for private companies. We would not grant a license if there was a clear risk that the items might be used for internal repression. And additionally, of course, as I was discussing with Mr. Stewart, we are moving forward the whole international policy on this so that the requirements are going to get tougher. But the great majority of these licenses are for things of that kind.
But can the committee be expected to believe that none of the 194 extant cryptographic licenses to China, valued at 571.8 million, might not have either a clear risk or might be used to facilitate internal repression in that country?
Well, that, as I say, we go through each of these licenses individually. And something that is to build a virtual private network for a private company is not something that is where there is a clear risk of being used for internal repression in China. The majority of licenses are for things of that kind and of the kinds that I described a moment ago. I don't know if the officials would like to offer additional reassurance on that.
Okay. That's all right.
Of course.
I mean, if I could just say, as Anclu has raised China, China surely is a country where you cannot make a distinction between the private sector and the public sector. They are together, effectively. And that is why our brows raise when the largest single number of cryptographic equipment licenses of this group of countries is actually to China, nearly 200.
Well, China's become a more complex economy and society, I think, is one point to make. Second, given that it is now the second biggest economy in the world, it's not surprising that it shows up to a large extent in export figures. And third, we are able to analyse to a good level of detail the uses to which particular technologies can be put. And we're very mindful of that in assessing each licence.
Right, we'll move on to the UK consolidated criteria and the EU common position. Mark Hendrick.
Foreign Secretary, in the government's response to the committee's report from last year, the government stated that it intended to review the UK's consolidated criteria in order to bring it into line with the EU's common position. And in your response to our last report, it was stated that the EU had completed its review process on the EU common position, quote, provisionally. What was meant by provisionally? And when will the final review be concluded?
Well, the External Action Service of the EU is managing the review of the common position, and so the timescales are in their hands. Timescales are set in Brussels. The review of the legal text is complete, and all the member states and the EU are satisfied that the current 8 criteria have stood the test of time, and that those criteria don't need amendment at this stage, and that was announced at the end of 2012. But we're also all agreed there are practical steps we need to take to improve coordination at the EU level. We agreed to look at the EU Users Guide to bring it up to date, and it needs updating in the light of the recent adoption of the Arms Trade Treaty. So those are the things that are now being worked on, and we will keep you up to date. We're working on bringing the criteria into line with the ATT and the EU common position. I will write to you shortly about the update of the criteria and when and how we expect it to now take place.
Yeah, will you publish the outcome of the provisional review? That's the EU's provisional review. You mentioned briefly the review of the UK's consolidated criteria. Is there going to be a public consultation around that?
We are there's the review with the EU member states on the UK consolidated criteria. The work that is going on there is on the subjects I've just mentioned, on bringing it into line with the Arms Trade Treaty, with the updates to the EU common position. I think on publication, that's the EU. Well, that's up to the EU to
I think once it's completed,
decide about that.
It's completed,
but I don't see any reason why it shouldn't be published, and would be in favour of doing so.
And the public consultation on the UK's review of the consolidated criteria?
Well, I will write to the committees about the update of the criteria, and we'll take that request into account.
Okay, thanks.
Do you agree that the EU common position is a floor, not a ceiling?
Yes, I think so, Mr. Chair. Yes, we certainly wouldn't want to. Yes, it's not something we would want to be below, as it were. So it is a floor.
And you don't preclude being above?
We don't preclude being above it. No, that's right.
Fabian Hamilton.
Thank you, Chairman. We have been informed by the UK working group of NGOs that the revised User's Guide, incorporating changes to criteria 7 and 8, I think to do with the basis on which you can export arms and associated materials to countries throughout the world, has been issued, and that member states of the EU Council Working Group on Conventional Arms are expected to use this guidance on a trial basis. Is the British government using this new guidance, and if so, what impact has it had so far?
In the case of the UK implementing, for instance, Criteria 8, changes to Criteria 8, doesn't make that much difference because we already have a sophisticated methodology for Criterion 8. But we are already implementing at national level the changes on this. Richard, again, you might want to just add a sentence to...
That's right. It was agreed on a provisional basis, the revised guidance for Criteria 7 and Criteria 8, and now all the member states are giving it a trial run to see how it works. And we're doing the same, and it's working well. And now we're also going on in Brussels to look at the other, the user guide on the other criteria to see what might need updating with them.
The UK working group has suggested to us that the British government should persuade EU member states to publish the reviews of Criteria 7 and 8 without further delay, and if they don't agree, then we should publish it unilaterally. Would you try and persuade member states to publish the review? And if not, will you publish it unilaterally?
I'm happy to look at. I'm always in favour of transparency. We're often ahead of the rest of the EU on that.
I think we're hoping that the review will be complete later this year. We've got it this trial run. We'll complete the review of all the criteria, and then once it's agreed, there'll be the new EU Users Guide, and that will be published.
We will favour transparency.
Foreign Secretary, Arms Trade Treaty, please. Anne McKitchen.
Foreign Secretary, if I can combine two questions in one, given the time constraints. When will the government implement the secondary legislation to be compliant with the Arms Trade Treaty, and by what date do you expect the government to ratify the treaty?
On ratification, Parliament's completed its procedures, as you know, on the 4th of November. We can't ratify until we receive agreement from the European Parliament because the treaty covers matters of EU exclusive competence in addition to matters of national confidence. So we're not, therefore, not in independent control of that. But with that in mind, we expect to ratify by the spring of this year. On the subject of the secondary legislation, that is needed, you're quite right, to ensure it's consistent with UK legislation. BIS are in the lead on this. The current plan is to roll the amendments together with other changes, such as the ones to the military list and updates to the consolidated criteria, so that we can produce a single package, as it were, for businesses and minimise the additional regulatory burden on businesses.
Okay, thank you very much.
Foreign Secretary, what is the government's policy on developing a code of conduct on the indirect financing of cluster munitions?
On cluster munitions, well, as you know and as your question implies, direct financing is clearly prohibited. Indirect financing is not. We think a voluntary approach is preferable to government intervention, but we don't rule out, as I think I said last year, the government taking a more active role. I would like to see how things develop on this. I welcome the steps taken on a voluntary basis by a number of British financial institutions. But we will continue to monitor this closely. We'll look at it again with the financial sector, if necessary, to see when and whether there's scope and need for the government to act.
Foreign Secretary, we seem to have managed to beat the division.
Well done.
I'm grateful to you, Mr. Tifare and Mr. Paber. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Portcullis House, the Wilson Room.